No one expected this meeting to matter anymore. 40 years had passed. The rivalry belonged to history books. The fight had become legend. Most people thought everything that needed to be said between Muhammad Ali and George Foreman had already been decided in the ring, under hot lights, roaring crowds, and the pressure of a world watching. After all, what could possibly be left after decades of silence? But when they finally stood face to face again, something shifted in the air. There were no gloves, no referees, no belt on the line. Ali was no longer the fast, talking, floating butterfly the world remembered. His movements were slower now. His body carried the weight of years, of battles both inside and outside the ring. Yet somehow his presence still filled the room. Foreman, once feared as the most dangerous puncher alive, stood quietly in front of him. Older, calmer, carrying a past he had learned to live with, but never truly forget. For a moment, neither man spoke, and in that silence, the world realized this meeting was never about boxing. It was about time. It was about what remains when the noise fades, when the cheers are gone, the rivalry's cool, and all that's left are two human beings looking at who they used to be. People watching expected nostalgia, maybe a smile, maybe a polite handshake. What they didn't expect was the emotion, not the kind that explodes, the kind that quietly breaks you. Because when Ali and Foreman locked eyes, it wasn't champion versus challenger anymore. It was memory versus reality, youth versus age, pride versus peace, and suddenly, the greatest fight of their lives didn't feel like the one they had in the jungle. It felt like this moment. Two warriors standing still, realizing that no matter how strong you once were, time always wins. The room felt heavy, not with tension, but with understanding. People sensed they were witnessing something rare, something fragile, a closing chapter that didn't need words to be powerful. This wasn't a rematch. It was a reckoning. A reminder that legends don't just live in highlights. They live in unresolved moments, in shared history, and in the quiet courage it takes to face the past one last time. Have you ever reunited with someone who once defined your life and realized that time had changed both of you forever? The room was quiet. No roaring crowd. No blinding ring lights. No announcer's voice shaking the walls. This wasn't Madison Square Garden. This wasn't Kinshasa. This was just a simple room holding two men and a lifetime of memories. Muhammad Ali moved slowly now. Each step was careful, measured. His hands, once so fast they confused the eye, trembled slightly as they rested at his sides. Parkinson's had taken much from him, his speed, his voice, his ease. But it had not taken his presence. There was still something unmistakable about him. A quiet gravity. The kind that makes people stop talking without being asked. The kind that reminds you this man once carried the hopes, anger and pride of millions on his shoulders. Across from him stood George Foreman. He watched Ali closely, not with fear, not with rivalry, but with reflection. This wasn't the younger Foreman who once believed power could solve everything. This was a man who had lived lost, rebuilt himself, and learned that some victories don't feel like victories at all. For years, the world framed them as enemies. One had to win, one had to fall. That story was easy to tell when they were young, strong, and angry. But standing there now, that version of the story felt incomplete, almost childish, because in this quiet room, there was no enemy. There were just two aging men carrying decades of memory, memories of pain, pride, regret, and lessons learned the hard way. Ali wasn't thinking about rounds or strategies anymore. Foreman wasn't thinking about revenge or redemption. They were thinking about time, about how fast it passed, about how heavy it could feel, about how strange it is to meet someone who once defined your life and realize neither of you is that person anymore. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was honest. It was the kind of silence that only exists when words feel too small for what the moment carries. People in the room sensed it too. No one rushed it. No one interrupted. Because moments like this don't happen often, and when they do, you let them breathe. Time doesn't erase battles. It changes how we remember them. What once felt like war slowly becomes a shared chapter, one you can finally look at without anger. Do you believe time truly heals rivalries, or does it simply reshape them into something quieter, deeper, and harder to explain? Everyone remembered the rumble in the jungle. They remembered the noise, the heat, the shock. The night the world watched Muhammad Ali do what no one believed he could do. The night strategy defeated raw power. The night history changed forever. But for George Foreman, that night was never just a highlight. It was a shadow. For decades, it followed him everywhere, in interviews, in conversations, in rooms where people recognized his face before they knew his story. No matter what he achieved afterward, no matter how many fights he won, there was always one question waiting at the end. What happened in Africa? Fans never let him forget it. Commentators replayed it endlessly. Strangers spoke about it like it belonged to them. But they didn't carry it, he did. And now, standing inches away from Ali again, the weight of that night returned all at once. Not as anger, not as bitterness, but as memory, heavy and unavoidable. George looked at Ali's face, older now, softer, marked by time in ways the ring never could. And suddenly, the roar of the crowd from 40 years ago felt distant, almost unreal. What felt real was this moment. George leaned in closer, his voice low enough that only Ali could hear him. You changed my life that night. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't praise. It was a truth spoken after years of carrying it alone. Ali looked up at him and smiled faintly. Not the wide grin that once taunted opponents. Not the confident smile of a man holding a championship belt. This was different. It was the smile of someone who understood cost. Ali understood what it meant to win and still lose something. He understood sacrifice, the kind that doesn't show up in record books. He understood regret, not as weakness, but as part of being human. In that smile was an unspoken acknowledgement. I know what that night took from you. Because victories feel different when you're young. When you're young, winning feels light. It feels clean. It feels like proof. But when you're older, victories grow heavier. They come with memories, with consequences, with the realization that every triumph leaves something behind. That night in the jungle made Ali immortal. But it also tied Foreman's name to a single moment forever. And now, decades later, neither man could change that. They could only face it. The past didn't shout in that room. It whispered. It whispered about youth, about pride, about how quickly life moves when you're too busy proving yourself to notice. It whispered about how moments you think will pass stay with you longer than you ever expect. This wasn't about boxing anymore. It was about carrying something for 40 years and finally being seen by the only person who truly understood what it meant. Some victories feel lighter when you're young, but heavier when you're old, because by then, you understand what they cost. Is there a moment in your life that still follows you quietly, constantly, no matter how much time passes? Ali reached out slowly and took Foreman's hand. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't staged. It didn't ask for attention. But it carried more weight than any punch either man had ever thrown. No cameras needed words. No microphones needed sound. For a man once known as the most intimidating force in boxing, this was a different kind of vulnerability, a harder one. For years, Foreman had carried anger. Anger at himself. Anger at the moment that defined him. Anger at how the world froze him in time. Then came confusion. Why did that fight still matter so much? Why did it still follow him when he had lived an entire life afterward? And slowly, almost without noticing, anger gave way to respect. Respect for the courage it took to stand across from him that night and refuse to break. And now, standing here decades later, respect transformed into something deeper, gratitude. Because that fight, painful as it was, had forced Foreman to confront himself. It humbled him. It redirected him. It changed the course of his life in ways he couldn't understand at the time, but could finally appreciate now. Ali looked at him, his expression calm, almost tender. His voice was softer than the world remembered. Parkinson's had quieted much of his speech, but not its meaning. We gave them something they'd never forget, he said. It wasn't a boast. It was a shared truth. In that sentence, Ali wasn't talking about victory. He wasn't talking about belts or rankings or legacy. He was talking about meaning, the kind that outlives applause. In that moment, both men understood something most people never do. Winning fades. Understanding lasts. Ali knew what it meant to be misunderstood, to be hated, to be celebrated, and then slowly forgotten by the noise of the present. He knew what it meant to pay a price that no referee could count. Foreman knew what it meant to lose publicly and carry it privately for decades. And standing there together, hand in hand, they weren't reliving the past. They were releasing it. This wasn't forgiveness spoken out loud. It didn't need to be. Forgiveness doesn't always arrive as words. Sometimes it arrives as presence, as acknowledgement, as two people finally seeing each other clearly without the weight of pride. It wasn't about who won anymore. It was about what they shared. A moment that shaped their lives, a chapter written together, a history no one else could fully understand. And in that quiet exchange, something coalesced, not forgotten, but understood. True closure doesn't come from revenge or victory. It comes from understanding. When the past no longer controls how you feel about the present. Have you ever forgiven someone, not because they asked, not because they deserved it, but because carrying the weight any longer was costing you too much? George Foreman couldn't hold it in anymore. For a long moment he tried. He looked away, breathed slowly, tightened his jaw, the same way fighters do when they're trying not to show weakness. The same way he had done countless times in the ring. But this wasn't the ring. And this wasn't weakness. He stepped forward and pulled Muhammad Ali into a gentle embrace. Not sudden, not forceful, almost careful. As if he was afraid that time itself might break the moment if he moved too fast. The same man he once tried with everything he had to knock out was now the man he instinctively protected. Foreman's arm wrapped around Ali, not like an opponent, but like an older brother shielding someone fragile. Ali's body leaned slightly into him. For a second, it looked as though the years melted away, leaving only two men who understood each other without explanation. The room fell silent, not the awkward kind, the reverent kind. No one dared to speak, no one dared to move, because everyone felt it that something irreversible was happening, a moment you don't interrupt, a moment you let exist, even if it makes your chest tighten. Some legends end with trophies, gold belts, applause, numbers etched into record books. But others end with tears, quiet ones, unplanned ones, the kind that don't ask permission. This one ended with humanity. Ali didn't lift his arms much. He didn't need to. His presence alone carried the weight. Foreman's face was close to his shoulder now, his eyes closed. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't carrying the past alone. What broke him wasn't the memory of losing. It was the realization that he had spent years fighting something that no longer needed to be fought. Rivalry. Pride. The need to prove something to a moment that had already passed. And in that embrace, Foreman understood something deeply human. Some battles don't end when the bell rings. They end when you finally let go. Ali, once the loudest man in any room, said nothing. He didn't need to. His silence wasn't emptiness, it was peace. Peace that comes only after you've lived fully, after you've lost, after you've paid the price of greatness. People watching didn't see a fallen champion. They saw dignity. They saw a man who had nothing left to prove, and therefore everything to give. Foreman slowly pulled back, but his hand stayed on Ali's shoulders for a moment longer, as if grounding himself in the reality of it. His eyes were wet now. He didn't wipe them away. He didn't need to. Because strength wasn't what the world once thought it was. It wasn't intimidation. It wasn't dominance, wasn't being feared. It was this. Standing openly in emotion, honoring the past without being trapped by it, choosing compassion when ego would have been easier. In that quiet room, boxing disappeared. What remained was something far bigger. Two men, one shared history, no bitterness left, and everyone watching felt it in the same place, the chest, the throat, the place where memories live. Because moments like this remind us of something we forget too often. The hardest thing a strong person can do is be gentle. Strength isn't proven by dominance. It's revealed by compassion, especially when the world expects you to be hard. When was the last time you witnessed true strength? Not through power or force, but through kindness and restraint. People watching weren't crying because of boxing. They cried because they saw themselves. They saw old grudges they had carried longer than they meant to. They saw missed chances, conversations delayed, apologies never spoken. They saw words they thought they'd say someday, until someday quietly passed. This moment reached far beyond the sport. Because what unfolded between Muhammad Ali and George Foreman wasn't about who was greater. It wasn't about rewriting history or settling debates. It was about reflection. Ali didn't speak much anymore. His voice, once sharp and musical, had been softened by time and illness. Parkinson's had taken his speed, his speech, and much of his physical freedom. But his silence said everything. It said, I've lived. It said, I've fought. It said, I've learned what truly matters. There was no bitterness left in him. No need to relive old victories or remind the world who he once was. Ali had already given everything, to boxing, to belief, to the idea that a human being could stand for more than just themselves. Foreman understood that now in a way he never could have, when he was young. Watching Ali struggle to move, yet still command respect without effort, changed something deep inside him. It reframed the past. The loss that once felt like a wound now felt like a turning point. Later, Foreman would say something simple, but powerful. That moment mattered more than any rematch. And coming from a man who had returned to boxing, reclaimed a championship, and rewritten his own legacy, That statement carried weight. Because it meant this. No title ever gave him what that moment did. No victory ever brought the peace that acceptance finally delivered. People in the room felt it too. Some thought about people they hadn't spoken to in years. Some thought about arguments that no longer made sense. Some thought about pride and how expensive it can be over time. That's the quiet power of moments like this. They don't shout lessons at you. They invite you to look inward. Ali and Foreman didn't just close a chapter for themselves. They held up a mirror for everyone watching. A reminder that life isn't a series of wins and losses. It's a series of chances to choose what you carry forward. Some fights sharpen you. Others harden you. And some, if you're brave enough, teach you when to let go. Ali had learned that lesson early, then paid for it slowly over a lifetime. Foreman learned it later, but fully. And in that quiet aftermath, you could see it written on both of them, not in words, but in posture, expression, and stillness. There was no crowd reaction demanded, no applause needed. The meaning landed softly and stayed. Because when the noise fades, when the lights dim, and when the past finally stops asking for your attention, you're left with one question. What are you still fighting that no longer needs a winner? Some fights are meant to be won. Others are meant to be released, because holding on costs more than letting go ever will. If you met your greatest rival today, not as an enemy, but as another human shaped by time, what would you say to finally put the past to rest? That meeting didn't rewrite history, it completed it. History didn't need correction, it needed closure. For decades, the story had been simple winner and loser, legend and lesson, dominance and defeat. The world loves clean endings. It loves scorecards and highlights. It loves knowing who stood tall when the dust settled. But life is rarely that simple. When Muhammad Ali and George Foreman stood together in that final meeting, something became clear. Some stories aren't finished when the crowd goes home. Some chapters wait quietly for years, until the people who lived them are ready to return without armor. Two men, one past, no bitterness left. That's what made the moment so powerful. There was no need to debate who was greater. No need to replay old footage or argue strategy. Those questions belonged to another time, another version of themselves. What mattered now wasn't who won, but what they had both survived. They had survived fame. They had survived expectation. They had survived becoming symbols instead of people. And standing there together, stripped of rivalry, they showed the world something boxing never could on its own, how greatness looks when it ages. Ali, once the loudest voice in any room, now spoke mostly through stillness. His body no longer obeyed him the way it once had, but his spirit remained undeniable. He didn't need to remind anyone who he was. His life had already answered that question. Foreman, once feared for his power, now stood grounded in humility. He had learned slowly, painfully, that strength isn't just what you can do to others. It's what you're willing to face within yourself. That meeting wasn't about forgiveness spoken aloud. It was about forgiveness lived. Forgiveness that didn't erase the past, but loosened its grip. Forgiveness that didn't require an apology, but offered peace anyway. And the boxing world felt it. Fans, fighters, commentators, people who had spent years arguing about punches and plans, fell silent. Because suddenly, none of that mattered as much as this truth. The greatest battles don't end in the ring. They end in the heart. They end when pride stops asking for proof. They end when memory softens instead of burns. They end when two people realize they don't need to win anymore. That's why this moment lasted longer than any knockout. Because knockouts fade, but resolution stays. People watching carried that feeling with them long after the video ended. Not because they loved boxing, but because they recognized themselves in it, in the grudges they've held too long, in the people they once competed with hurt or misunderstood, in the quiet wish for one more conversation, to explain, to forgive, or simply to say, I understand now. Ali and Foreman didn't just close their chapter, they offered a mirror. A reminder that life isn't about how loudly you prove yourself, but how gently you lay things down when the fight is over. And maybe that's the final lesson they left behind. That legacy isn't just built in moments of triumph, it's built in moments of humility, in choosing peace over pride, in understanding that respect earned late in life is often the most honest kind. History will always remember the fight, but the heart remembers this. Two men standing still, time finally quiet, nothing left to defend. If you believe true greatness is humility, forgiveness, and respect, type Legend in the comments. And tell me honestly, if time gave you one last chance, who would you want one final conversation with, And what would you finally say?